What happens when someone pretends to be something they're just not? I was helping my brother Gluttno set up his Purple Heart display when I heard him tell his friend over the phone, "These morons actually think I earned this in combat." My blood ran cold. He said it in military jargon, terminology I'd learned during the deployment I never told anyone about. I stayed perfectly still, listening to Gluttno continuing to brag. "Only 3 weeks till I get approved for that 200,000 veteran business loan. Once I milk this PTSD performance, we'll be set for life." His buddy cackled through the speaker. "Your strategy of fake breakdowns every time they ask technical questions is brilliant. I'm not flipping burgers when fraud pays this well." Gluttno's wife, Ava, sat nearby, still wearing makeup to cover the bruises from Gluttno's last flashback when she'd questioned their missing rent money. I caught her eye and mouthed bathroom, our old childhood code for "we need to talk." When we finally made an excuse to be in the hallway alone, she whispered urgently, "I can't take this anymore." That's when I told her everything, what I'd overheard, what I was planning. Her eyes went from terrified to determined. "Whatever you need me to do," she said. "I'm in." That night, we coordinated our strategy. Every interaction from here on would be calculated to push Gluttno further into exposing himself. Ava would play her part perfectly, the scared wife who asks just the right questions at just the right moments. I'd installed hidden recording devices throughout his home while he was passed out drunk. The investigators I'd contacted needed more evidence, but Ava and I had a plan that would give them everything. Something that would destroy him completely. The next morning over coffee, I observed Gluttno carefully. "Ava looked pretty hurt after yesterday's incident," I said casually. "Maybe you should make things right." He scoffed. Then came his moment of opportunity. Ava nervously mentioned their overdue utilities bill, and Gluttno launched into his practiced meltdown. "You have no idea what I've endured overseas," he bellowed, slamming his fist down on the table. While she cowered, he quickly texted in military code, "Like clockwork, target fully suppressed." The response came instantly. "Ever feel guilty about attacking your own wife?" Gluttno typed back with one hand. "Guilty? Once loan clears, I'm going dark. She'll never find me." All these violent episodes, though. 7 calculated performances. Each builds PTSD credibility. 7 documented incidents meant he'd already built his federal case. Time to make him overconfident. The following day, I was preparing dinner when I overheard him video calling his supervisor. "Listen here, you pathetic middle management wannabe, I quit. Keep your chump change for someone desperate enough to need it." "Tough conversation?" I asked innocently, bringing him a plate. "Greatest day of my existence," he slurred, already intoxicated before evening. "Soon I'll be wealthy enough to buy this entire neighborhood." That's when his phone buzzed with another coded text. "If the PTSD charade is going to succeed, why wait? Start spending now." I watched Gluttno immediately rush to the motorcycle dealership, financing a $75,000 bike based on money that would never materialize. His recklessness stunned me. Within mere days, he had already committed to expenses far exceeding his imaginary windfall. By the 3rd day, he'd completely unraveled. I observed him storming into the loan office, demanding they fast-track his approval immediately. When they explained normal processing timelines, he detonated. "Do you realize what I've given up for America?" he roared. "I'm a decorated combat hero. You civilians should be honored to serve me." Security footage captured everything while bystanders gawked and laughed. The final confrontation was flawless. Gluttno rose unsteadily, wearing his new designer outfit purchased with their emergency savings. "Here's to success," he declared. "To brilliant financial strategies." That's when Ava quietly asked about their eviction notice. Gluttno's face lit up with malicious anticipation, preparing another fake breakdown. "Obviously, I'm securing our family's future," he announced, then quickly typed in military code, "Initiating final performance. Maximum psychological impact required." But before he could strike her, 4 federal agents entered through our front door. "Mr. Gluttno Tin, we're investigating fraudulent veteran benefit claims." One of the agents motioned for me to follow him, while 2 others guided Ava toward the kitchen, and a 4th stayed with Gluttno in the living room. I got separated from them fast, led down the hallway into what used to be Gluttno's home office. The woman who entered behind me had short, dark hair and carried a leather folder. She introduced herself as Sloan Carter from the Federal Investigator's Office and explained they were looking into possible fraud connected to veteran benefit claims. Her voice stayed calm and professional the whole time, not aggressive or accusatory, just matter of fact. I felt my heart start beating a little slower because she seemed like someone who actually wanted to understand what happened rather than just make arrests. She asked me to start from the beginning and tell her everything I knew. I pulled out my phone and showed her the recordings I'd made over the past 5 days. She listened to each one carefully, her face staying neutral but her pen moving constantly across her notepad. Then I showed her screenshots of the coded text messages between Gluttno and his buddy, the ones where they discussed the whole scheme in military jargon. She asked me to send everything to her secure email address, and I did it right there while she watched. After reviewing the timeline of staged incidents I'd documented, she looked up and told me this was solid preliminary evidence. but she explained they'd need more to build a case strong enough for prosecution because defense lawyers would argue the recordings were taken without proper consent, and the texts could be interpreted different ways. In the other room, I could hear Ava's voice through the wall, shaky at first, but getting steadier as she talked. She was giving her initial interview about the pattern of fake flashbacks and the real violence that came with them. I couldn't make out specific words, but I recognized the rhythm of her speech, how she always got more confident once she started explaining things with dates and details. The advocate Lillian Perkins sat beside her taking careful notes, I learned later. Ava described each incident with specifics about what Gluttno said, what he did, how she got hurt. Her voice kept getting stronger as she went through the list, like finally telling the truth out loud was giving her energy instead of draining it. Lillian wrote everything down and asked follow-up questions about timing and witnesses and whether Ava had any photos of injuries. Agent Carter asked me about the military jargon in the texts, and I knew this moment was coming, but it still felt weird to say it out loud. I finally admitted my own deployment history that I'd kept hidden for years, explaining where I served and what my role was. She didn't ask why I stayed silent about it, which I appreciated. She just nodded and said my ability to translate the coded messages would be crucial for proving intent. Without someone who understood the terminology, the defense could claim those texts meant something innocent. But with my background, I could explain exactly what phrases like target suppressed and performance protocol actually meant in military context. Gluttno sat in the third room with his lawyer, who arrived within an hour of the agents showing up. Through the wall, I heard him trying his usual aggressive bluster, raising his voice and demanding to know what authority they had to be in his house. His lawyer kept telling him to stay calm, but Gluttno wouldn't shut up. Agent Carter told me quietly that his behavior right now was actually helping their case. When someone who claims severe PTSD acts this aggressive and controlled during a stressful situation, it shows their real personality. The PTSD act usually drops when people get cornered, and watching him perform for his lawyer while staying perfectly composed proved he could control his reactions when he wanted to. By late morning, the agents had secured all of Gluttno's devices, including his phone, laptop, and tablet. They bagged everything as evidence and explained the investigation timeline to everyone. Agent Carter told Ava she needed to find somewhere safe to stay because Gluttno would be released today pending the investigation. They couldn't hold him without charges, and charges would take time to file properly. I watched fear flash across Ava's face when she heard that, her whole body tensing up. But before she could panic, Lillian started outlining shelter options. She explained there was a facility across town with immediate availability, 24-hour security, and staff trained in supporting people leaving abusive situations. Ava asked me privately if I could help her pack some things before Gluttno got back from wherever the agents took him for additional questioning. We worked quickly to gather her essentials, moving through the house like we were on a timed mission. She grabbed clothes, documents, medications, a few personal items that mattered to her. She was scared. I could see it in how her hands shook while folding shirts, but she also seemed relieved. Someone finally believed her story, took it seriously enough to investigate, treated her like a real person instead of just Gluttno's wife. I promised I'd be available whenever she needed support through this process. I gave her my number, told her to call anytime, day or night, said I'd help however I could. Agent Carter pulled me aside before we left and gave me strict instructions not to provoke or engage with Gluttno anymore. She explained that everything from here needed to be by the book. Any appearance of entrapment or harassment could compromise the case we'd worked so hard to build. If Gluttno contacted me, I should document it but not respond. If he tried to start a confrontation, I should leave and call the police. The investigation had to proceed through proper channels now, no more amateur detective work. Lillian got Ava set up with intake paperwork for the domestic violence shelter across town. The facility had immediate availability, which felt like incredible luck after everything. The shelter provided Ava with a new phone number that Gluttno didn't know, a basic cell phone with prepaid minutes that couldn't be traced back to her. They reviewed safety protocols for if he tried to find or contact her. Don't go to familiar places alone. Don't follow predictable routines. Don't tell mutual friends where you're staying. Change your routes to work. Park in well-lit areas. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong. Ava listened carefully to every instruction, nodding and asking questions about specific scenarios. I drove Ava to the shelter that evening after we finished packing, and she completed all the paperwork. She stayed quiet during the ride, staring out the window at the passing streets, but she gripped her bag tightly in her lap, like she was afraid someone might take it from her. When we arrived at the shelter, the building looked plain and ordinary from outside, which I guess was the point. The staff who met us at the secure entrance were kind and efficient, checking Ava's intake forms and showing her where she'd be staying. I watched her disappear through that entrance, feeling both relieved she was finally safe and angry that any of this was necessary in the first place. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:30. Agent Matthew from the federal office wanted to meet about Gluttno's loan paperwork. I drove to a coffee shop near the courthouse where he had spread out copies of the application across a corner table. He pointed to the income section first. Gluttno claimed he made $180,000 annually from a veteran-owned business that didn't exist. The employment history listed 3 companies that Matthew had already checked. 2 were out of business, and the third had no record of ever hiring anyone named Glutno Tin. The medical records attached to prove his PTSD diagnosis didn't match any official military database. Matthew showed me how the doctor's signature on one form belonged to a physician who had retired 5 years before the date on the document. Every single page had problems like this: inflated numbers, fake companies, forged signatures. I watched Matthew highlight each issue with a yellow marker until the papers looked like someone had spilled paint on them. He explained that loan fraud cases usually had 1 or 2 red flags, but Glutno's application was basically a checklist of every possible violation. Around 10 that morning, Danielle from the loan office called Agent Carter to set up her formal statement. I was still with Matthew when Carter put the call on speaker, so we could all hear. Danielle said the other staff members were still talking about Glutno's visit and how he had screamed at everyone. She mentioned the security footage showed him pounding on the counter while customers backed toward the exit. One elderly woman had actually left without completing her transaction because she felt unsafe. Danielle wanted to give her statement as soon as possible because she kept having nightmares about him coming back. Carter scheduled her for that afternoon and thanked her for being willing to testify if needed. After the call ended, Matthew and I looked at each other. The evidence was piling up faster than I expected. That afternoon, I met Carter at the Federal Building to help create a complete timeline of everything. She had a huge whiteboard set up in a conference room with dates running across the top. We started mapping out each staged episode that Ava had told us about. The first fake flashback happened in March, when Ava questioned why their savings account was empty. The second came in April after she found credit card bills he had hidden. We plotted all 7 incidents with exact dates and what triggered each one. Then we added the coded text messages underneath each episode. The pattern became obvious once we laid it out visually. Every time Ava got close to discovering his financial lies, Glutno would stage a PTSD breakdown to shut down the conversation. Carter used different colored markers for different types of evidence. Red for the fake episodes, blue for financial decisions, green for text messages. By the time we finished, the board looked like a complicated map, but the story it told was crystal clear. Glutno had been running this scheme for at least 8 months. He quit his job in May based on loan money he didn't have yet. He financed the motorcycle in early June. He bought designer clothes and expensive dinners throughout that same month. Every purchase assumed the $200,000 was coming. Carter took photos of the completed timeline from multiple angles. She said this visual representation would be powerful in court because it showed planning and intent over a long period. This wasn't some mistake or misunderstanding. This was calculated fraud. My phone buzzed around 6 that evening. Ava was calling from her new number at the shelter. Her voice sounded rough, like she had been crying for hours, but she also seemed more focused than yesterday. She told me Glutno had tried calling her old phone 15 times since this morning. The shelter staff had helped her listen to the voicemails he left. The first few started out apologetic and sweet. He said he missed her and wanted to talk things through. But by message 7, his tone had shifted completely. He accused her of betraying him and ruining his life. By message 12, he was making threats about what would happen when he found her. Message 15 was just heavy breathing, and then him saying her name in a way that made her skin crawl. She felt relieved she had changed her number before he could keep harassing her directly. The shelter had given her a basic phone with prepaid minutes that couldn't be traced back to her location. She asked if I thought he would actually try to find her. I told her honestly that I didn't know, but the protective order process was already starting, and the shelter had good security. She thanked me for everything and said she was trying to sleep, but kept jumping at every sound in the hallway. I promised to check in tomorrow and reminded her that Lillian was available anytime she needed to talk. The next morning, Carter called me to her office to set up a secure backup system for all the text evidence. She explained that we needed to be extremely careful about how we handled everything from this point forward. Even small mistakes in the evidence chain could let Glutno walk free on technical problems. She showed me how to upload copies of all the messages to an encrypted cloud storage system that only federal investigators could access. Each file needed specific labels with dates, times, and source information. We spent 2 hours going through proper procedures for documenting where each piece of evidence came from and who had handled it. Carter emphasized that defense lawyers would look for any gap or inconsistency they could use to challenge the evidence. If we couldn't prove continuous custody of the recordings and messages, a judge might throw them out completely. I took notes on everything she explained: how to photograph evidence with timestamps, how to maintain logs of who accessed what files and when, how to create multiple backup copies in different secure locations. The process felt tedious, but I understood why it mattered. We had worked too hard building this case to lose it because of sloppy paperwork. That same afternoon, I was checking my email when I saw that Glutno had posted something on social media. His post talked about temporary setbacks and jealous family members who couldn't handle his success. Several friends had commented with supportive messages telling him to stay strong. I immediately forwarded the link to Carter, who sent it to Agent Matthew. Within an hour, Matthew had taken screenshots of the entire thread, including all the comments. He explained that these posts were actually helpful for the case because Gluttno was still publicly claiming veteran status while under investigation. The post mentioned his service and sacrifice, even though he knew federal agents were looking into his records. This showed he was continuing the fraudulent behavior even after being confronted. Matthew saved multiple copies of everything before Gluttno could delete it. He also set up alerts to capture any future posts automatically. Carter told me later that ongoing fraud during an investigation usually resulted in harsher sentences because it showed the person had no intention of stopping. Ava met with Lillian the following day for a longer documentation session. Lillian had scheduled 3 hours to go through every violent incident in complete detail. They started with the first episode back in March and worked forward chronologically. For each incident, Lillian recorded the exact date, what triggered it, what Gluttno did, what injuries Ava sustained, and whether anyone else witnessed it. Ava described how the March incident left bruises on her arms where he grabbed her. The April episode resulted in a split lip when he shoved her into a doorframe. June had been the worst with a black eye that took 2 weeks to fully heal. Lillian photographed the bruises that were still visible on Ava's arms and shoulders. The marks had faded to yellow and green, but you could still see the finger-shaped patterns where he had gripped her. Lillian explained that this evidence would support both the criminal case against Gluttno and Ava's application for a permanent protective order. The detailed timeline with specific dates and injuries showed a clear pattern of escalating violence tied to his fraud scheme. Every time Ava got close to exposing his lies, he used violence to control her. Lillian printed out copies of everything for Ava's records and sent digital versions to Carter's secure system. I spent that evening going through my own deployment paperwork to provide comparison documentation. I hadn't looked at these records in years because I never told anyone about my service. Now I spread them across my kitchen table. My DD-214 showed my actual military occupational specialty and deployment dates. My medical records documented a minor knee injury from training, but nothing related to PTSD or combat trauma. My service was real but unremarkable. I had done my job and come home without the dramatic experiences Gluttno was claiming. Carter came by to pick up copies, and we sat at the table comparing my authentic paperwork to Gluttno's fabrications. The differences were obvious once you knew what to look for. His Purple Heart had a serial number that didn't exist in the official database. His DD-214 listed a military specialty that didn't match his claimed deployment location. His medical documentation used terminology that actual military doctors wouldn't use. Seeing my real papers next to his fake ones made the fraud even more clear. I had proof of what genuine military service looked like, and his claims fell apart under any serious examination. Carter thanked me for finally sharing this part of my history. She said my credibility as a witness was actually stronger because I had nothing to gain from exposing him. I wasn't seeking attention or benefits. I just wanted to stop him from stealing from a system that helped real veterans. 2 days later, Ava found something while unpacking her belongings at the shelter apartment. An old handwritten note from Gluttno tucked into one of her books. The note was dated from 4 months ago, and the message made her hands shake. He had written that there would be serious consequences if she ever embarrassed him by questioning their finances in front of other people. The note specifically threatened that she would regret making him look bad. Ava immediately took photos of the note with her phone from multiple angles, showing the handwriting clearly. She sent the images to Lillian, who forwarded them straight to Carter. This note was perfect evidence of his intimidation tactics. It showed premeditated threats tied directly to the financial fraud. He had been planning to use fear and violence to keep her quiet about his schemes. Carter added the note to the evidence file as proof that the abuse wasn't random or related to any real PTSD. It was calculated intimidation to maintain control over someone who could expose his lies. That same week, Agent Matthew interviewed the manager at the motorcycle dealership where Gluttno had financed his $75,000 bike. The manager pulled up the application records and confirmed everything Matthew suspected. Gluttno had claimed the $200,000 veteran business loan was already approved and would fund within days. He had provided fake documentation showing the loan approval letter with forged signatures. The dealership had processed the financing based on those fraudulent papers because everything looked legitimate at first glance. The manager explained they normally wouldn't approve that much financing for someone with Gluttno's actual income and credit score. But the supposed loan approval changed their risk assessment completely. Now the dealership was stuck with a repossessed motorcycle they had paid $75,000 for and a customer who clearly couldn't afford it. The manager was willing to testify about the fraudulent documents and how Gluttno had deliberately misrepresented his financial situation. Matthew thanked him and added his statement to the growing case file. Every interview revealed another layer of Gluttno's fraud and brought us closer to having an airtight case that no defense lawyer could tear apart. The next morning, I drove to Danielle Green's loan office to collect the official incident report. She had everything ready in a manila folder and handed it across her desk with a tired expression. The report detailed Gluttno's threatening behavior in clear language that would hold up in court. She also gave me a list with 3 other employee names who had witnessed the outburst. Each one had already agreed to provide written statements about his aggressive demands and his false claims about combat service. I thanked her and left with the folder, knowing this documentation would strengthen the case significantly. Meanwhile, across town, Ava sat in the shelter's intake office filling out paperwork with shaking hands. The legal advocate sat beside her explaining each form patiently. When they finished the intake documents, the advocate reviewed all the documented incidents we had compiled over the past week. She looked through the photos of bruises, the timeline of staged episodes, and the witness accounts. Then she confirmed that Ava had strong grounds for a temporary protective order based on the clear pattern of escalating violence. The advocate explained the hearing process step by step and what Ava would need to present to the judge. Ava felt relieved knowing someone believed her and that the system had actual procedures to help. That same afternoon, Gluttno started trying to reach Ava through mutual friends. He sent messages that swung wildly between apologetic and manipulative. One message claimed he was getting help and wanted to talk things through. The next message accused her of ruining his life and demanded she stop cooperating with investigators. A friend forwarded these messages to Ava at the shelter. She immediately showed them to Lillian and also sent copies to Agent Carter. Both women documented the contact attempts as clear violations of Ava's safety plan. Agent Carter noted that Gluttno was already showing he couldn't respect boundaries, even with a federal investigation ongoing. The following day, Agent Carter called me into her office downtown. She had printed out all the coded military text messages between Gluttno and Chet Volkov. She spread them across the conference table and asked me to translate each phrase into plain English. I went through them one by one, explaining what the military jargon actually meant in proper context. The translations revealed explicit discussions of fraud tactics. They talked about faking specific symptoms. They discussed plans to exploit weaknesses in the veteran benefit system. They even joked about how easy it was to fool civilian administrators who didn't know real military culture. Agent Carter recorded my explanations carefully and had me annotate each message with the accurate translation. This evidence would prove intent beyond any reasonable doubt. While we worked on the translations, Agent Howell was following up on the motorcycle situation. The dealership had sent Gluttno a repossession notice after his first payment bounced. Agent Howell obtained a copy of that notice through a subpoena. The document provided additional proof of Gluttno's financial recklessness. It showed he had assumed the fraudulent loan money would cover his spending spree. The repossession timeline matched perfectly with when his loan application was actually denied. This created a clear picture of someone spending money he never had based on benefits he didn't deserve. Back at the shelter, Ava started preparing for her protective order hearing with Lillian's guidance. They sat together going over what Ava would need to say in court. Lillian reminded her that judges need specific incidents with actual dates and clear outcomes. They don't want emotional generalizations or vague statements about feeling scared. Ava practiced presenting the key facts in a calm, clear voice. She rehearsed describing the staged flashback that led to her black eye in March. She practiced explaining the pattern of manufactured triggers that Gluttno used to justify his violence. Lillian coached her through staying focused on concrete details rather than getting overwhelmed by emotion. After several practice runs, Ava's statement sounded solid and believable. Meanwhile, Agent Carter was analyzing the text message metadata more carefully. She tracked the frequency and timing of messages between Gluttno and Chet Volkov. The data clearly identified Chet as Gluttno's primary accomplice in the fraud scheme. They had exchanged hundreds of messages over several months, planning every detail. Agent Carter scheduled an interview with Chet for the following week. When she told me about it, her tone suggested she expected him to fold quickly under pressure once confronted with all the evidence. People like Chet usually weren't prepared for actual consequences. I also needed to gather more financial documentation. I contacted the motorcycle dealership and requested copies of the financing contract Gluttno had signed. The manager emailed me the documents within hours. The contract showed Gluttno had claimed $180,000 in annual income from his supposed veteran-owned business. That business didn't exist anywhere in public records. Agent Howell added these financing documents to the growing pile of fraudulent statements Gluttno had made to various financial institutions. Each false claim built a stronger case for prosecution. Ava recorded another detailed statement with Lillian about the complete history of staged episodes versus real violence. She described how Gluttno would deliberately manufacture triggers to explain away his abuse. If she questioned their finances, he would claim she had mentioned something that reminded him of combat. If she asked where money went, he would stage a flashback and become violent. Over time, Ava learned to recognize the difference between his calculated performances and his genuine anger. The performances always happened when she got too close to discovering his fraud. The real anger came out when he was drunk and felt completely in control. Her statement painted a clear picture of systematic manipulation and abuse. Then something unexpected happened. The neighbor who lived in the house next door contacted Ava after hearing about the investigation through neighborhood gossip. She told Ava she had witnessed one of Gluttno's violent outbursts about 6 months ago. She had heard shouting and crashing sounds through the shared wall. She had seen Ava outside the next day with visible bruises on her arms. The neighbor felt guilty for not saying something sooner, but she was willing to provide a statement to investigators now. Her testimony would corroborate Ava's timeline of escalating abuse. It would prove the violence wasn't recent or isolated. Agent Carter added the neighbor's contact information to her witness list. Every new piece of evidence made the case stronger and Gluttno's defense weaker. Agent Carter scheduled a meeting with the Domestic Violence Unit coordinator the next morning. I sat in on the call while she explained how Gluttno's fraud scheme connected directly to his abuse pattern. She walked through the timeline showing how each fake PTSD episode happened right after Ava questioned their finances. The coordinator understood immediately because she'd seen this before. Abusers who fake mental health conditions use those fake conditions as excuses for violence. It makes the abuse harder to prove because they hide behind supposed trauma. Agent Carter emphasized that Gluttno's calculated performances made both crimes worse. He wasn't just defrauding the government, and he wasn't just hitting his wife. He was using stolen valor as a weapon against her. The coordinator agreed to add domestic violence specialists to the investigation team. They would review Ava's medical records, interview the neighbor who heard the violence, and document the pattern of control. Agent Carter hung up looking satisfied. She told me that connecting the two cases would strengthen both prosecutions significantly. Meanwhile, Gluttno was making things worse for himself without realizing it. Agent Howell had obtained a warrant for his phone records and cloud backups before the arrest. Now he was monitoring Gluttno's activity in real time through the carrier system. Around noon that day, Howell called me with an update. Gluttno had started deleting his text message threads with Chet. He was going through systematically and wiping entire conversations. Howell actually laughed when he told me this. Every message Gluttno deleted was already preserved in 3 separate locations. The carrier kept records for legal purposes. The cloud backup system had copies, and we already had screenshots of the most important exchanges. But Gluttno deleting evidence showed he knew the messages were bad. It proved consciousness of guilt. Each deletion strengthened the obstruction case against him. Howell was documenting every single deletion with timestamps. He said prosecutors love this kind of thing because it shows the defendant knows they did something wrong. I asked if we should warn Gluttno somehow that deleting wouldn't help. Howell said absolutely not. Let him keep digging his own grave. That afternoon, Ava called me upset about a letter that arrived at the shelter. The landlord had started eviction proceedings against her and Gluttno for 3 months of unpaid rent. She was panicking because she thought this meant she'd have an eviction on her record. I told her to bring the letter to the shelter's legal aid office immediately. She met with an advocate who explained the actual situation clearly. Ava wasn't legally responsible for debt that Gluttno created through financial abuse. The advocate helped her gather documentation showing that Gluttno controlled all their finances. Ava had never had access to their bank accounts. She didn't know he was diverting rent money until the eviction notice arrived. The advocate drafted a response to the landlord explaining that Ava was a domestic violence victim separating from the abusive spouse. She wasn't contesting the eviction itself, but she wanted the record to show she wasn't responsible for the debt. The advocate also filed paperwork to ensure the eviction wouldn't appear on Ava's credit report under her name alone. It would list both tenants, but note that one was a victim of financial abuse. Ava felt much better after understanding she wasn't trapped by Gluttno's choices. She thanked me for pushing her to get legal help instead of just accepting the consequences. The next day, Agent Carter arranged a meeting with both me and Ava together. She said it was time for me to explain my full deployment history on the record. Ava sat across from me looking nervous. I hadn't told her any details about my service before. I'd kept it completely separate from my civilian life for years. Agent Carter started recording and I walked through the basics. Where I deployed, what my role was, why I learned the military terminology that let me recognize Gluttno's fraud. Ava's face showed hurt as I talked. She asked quietly why I never told her or anyone else in the family. I explained that I needed that boundary. I didn't want my service to define me. I didn't want people treating me differently or asking questions. When I came home, I just wanted to be a regular person again. Ava nodded slowly. She said she understood, but it still hurt that I kept such a big secret. Agent Carter stepped in at that point. She told Ava that my credibility as a witness was actually stronger because I had nothing to gain from exposing Gluttno. I wasn't competing for veteran benefits. I wasn't jealous of attention. I was just protecting her and stopping fraud. If I'd been public about my service the whole time, Gluttno's lawyers might claim I had ulterior motives. My silence made my testimony more powerful. Ava seemed to accept that explanation. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly before pulling back. Later that week, Ava met with Lillian for a longer session. She was struggling with complicated feelings about what she called betraying her husband. Even though Gluttno had abused her repeatedly, even though he'd planned to abandon her once the loan cleared, she still felt guilty about cooperating with investigators. Lillian spent time reframing the situation completely. She explained that Ava wasn't betraying anyone. Gluttno had chosen to commit fraud. Gluttno had chosen to use violence. Gluttno had chosen to control and manipulate. Ava was protecting herself from an abuser. Telling the truth isn't betrayal when someone is being harmed. Lillian asked Ava directly if she thought Gluttno would stop the violence on his own. Ava admitted he wouldn't. She said he'd been getting worse over time. More frequent episodes, more severe injuries, less pretense of remorse afterward. Lillian pointed out that stopping him now might save Ava's life. It might also stop him from doing this to someone else later. Ava cried for a while, but eventually said she understood. She knew intellectually that she was doing the right thing. The guilt was just hard to shake after years of Gluttno telling her that everything was her fault. Agent Carter called me 2 days later with an unusual request. She wanted to arrange a controlled phone call where I would contact Gluttno, pretending to want to work things out. She had obtained legal authorization to record the call. She coached me on what to say. I should sound conflicted and worried about family relationships. I should hint that maybe we all overreacted. I should give Gluttno an opening to brag about his scheme. I felt nervous making the call, but I trusted Agent Carter's plan. Gluttno answered on the second ring. I started with an apology for how everything went down. I said maybe we could talk through this situation calmly. Gluttno took the bait immediately. His voice shifted from cautious to confident within seconds. He started explaining how his staged episodes were perfectly timed to build credibility. He said the key was making each performance slightly different so they didn't seem rehearsed. He actually laughed about how easily Ava fell for the fake flashbacks. I kept my voice neutral and encouraging. I asked a few leading questions. Gluttno kept talking, clearly enjoying the chance to brag about how clever he'd been. He had no idea every word was recorded with proper legal authorization. When I finally ended the call, Agent Carter was listening on another line. She told me that recording was exactly what they needed. Gluttno had just confessed to fraud and abuse in his own words while thinking he was safe. Right after the controlled call ended, Ava experienced a complete crash. Lillian called me because Ava was questioning whether she could keep going through with everything. I drove to the shelter and found Ava sitting in the common room looking exhausted. She said she didn't know if she had the strength to testify or face Gluttno in court. She was scared of what he might do if he got out. She was scared of being alone. She was scared of everything. Lillian sat with us for 2 hours working through each fear systematically. She reminded Ava of the documented violence. She reminded her that Gluttno had explicitly planned to disappear and leave her with nothing. She reminded her that his behavior would only get worse if not stopped. Lillian showed Ava the evidence we'd gathered. The texts, the recordings, the witness statements, the financial records. All of it proved that Gluttno was dangerous and calculating. Ava looked at everything spread out on the table. She took several deep breaths. Finally, she said she would keep going. She said she owed it to herself and to any future woman Gluttno might target. She committed to seeing it through no matter how hard it got. The following morning, a tow truck showed up at Gluttno's driveway. The motorcycle dealership had officially repossessed the bike after his payments bounced. Neighbors stood in their yards watching the whole thing. Agent Howell drove by specifically to photograph the repossession. He wanted documentation of the exact timeline. The photos would show how quickly Gluttno's fraud scheme was falling apart, even before the investigation started. He'd financed a $75,000 motorcycle based on money that never existed. Within weeks, the dealership realized he couldn't pay. The repossession proved his financial recklessness and his assumption that fraudulent loan money would cover everything. Howell sent me copies of the photos. You could see Gluttno's face in one shot standing at his window watching the tow truck work. He looked angry, but also defeated. His overconfidence had destroyed him faster than we could have planned. That same week, Danielle from the loan office came in to provide her formal statement to investigators. She sat down with Agent Carter and walked through the entire incident when Gluttno stormed into their office. She confirmed that his loan application was placed on hold pending additional verification after his threatening behavior. She explained that the loan was never actually approved, despite what Gluttno claimed to everyone. His aggression had triggered extra checks on his application. The office manager had flagged his file for fraud review before the federal investigation even started. Danielle described exactly what Gluttno yelled about his supposed combat service. She confirmed that other customers had backed away nervously. She said the security footage captured everything clearly. Agent Carter thanked her for coming forward. She said Danielle's testimony would be crucial for showing Gluttno's pattern of using fake veteran status to intimidate and manipulate. Finally, Agent Howell received the subpoenaed bank records he'd requested weeks earlier. He spent an entire day going through 3 months of transactions. He called me that evening to share what he'd found. Gluttno had diverted rent money to personal spending consistently over that entire period. The records showed deposits from his job going into their joint account, then immediate transfers out to Gluttno's personal account that Ava didn't have access to. The rent never got paid. Instead, that money went to bars, online gambling, and expensive purchases. Howell highlighted one particularly clear example. The same day rent was due, Gluttno had transferred $900 to his personal account and spent it at a casino. Ava had asked him about rent that week, and he'd staged a violent flashback episode. The bank records proved financial abuse alongside the physical violence. They showed a clear pattern of Gluttno putting his wants over basic household needs. Howell said these records would be powerful evidence at trial. They proved Gluttno was systematically controlling and exploiting Ava while planning his fraud scheme. Within 2 days, Gluttno started calling relatives. I got my first angry text from our cousin demanding to know why I was spreading lies about family. Then my aunt called saying Gluttno told her Ava and I were making up stories to steal his loan money. My uncle left a voicemail accusing me of jealousy over Gluttno's success. I saved every message and took screenshots of every text. I forwarded everything to Agent Carter without responding to any of them. She called me that evening and explained that harassment from family members could actually result in additional charges against Gluttno if it continued. She told me to set clear boundaries and not discuss the case with anyone. I sent one group message to all the relatives who'd contacted me stating I was cooperating with a federal investigation and wouldn't discuss it further. Then I muted the group chat and blocked 3 relatives who kept sending hostile messages anyway. Meanwhile, Ava got a call from the courthouse about her protective order hearing date. She sat at the shelter's common table filling out the scheduling confirmation while Lillian reviewed her documentation folder. Ava had photographs of injuries, the neighbor's witness statement, medical records from 2 emergency room visits, and detailed incident reports with dates and descriptions. Lillian checked through everything twice to make sure nothing was missing. The shelter arranged transportation to court for the hearing date, and Lillian confirmed she would be there to support Ava through the testimony process. Ava's hands shook slightly as she signed the confirmation form, but her signature was clear and steady. Agent Carter scheduled Chet for an interview at the federal building. He showed up wearing a cheap suit and looking nervous. When Carter brought him into the interview room and started asking about the coded text messages, he immediately tried playing dumb. He claimed he didn't know what she was talking about. He said the messages were just jokes between friends. Carter let him talk for about 10 minutes before she slid the translated transcripts across the table. She showed him exactly what each coded phrase meant in military terminology. She explained that the messages proved his active participation in planning federal fraud. Then she outlined the charges he was facing as an accomplice. Chet's face went white. He asked if he could talk to a lawyer. Carter said absolutely, but she also mentioned that cooperation now would look much better than cooperation later. Chet sat there staring at the translations for a long time. Finally, he asked what cooperation would mean for his charges. Carter explained the prosecutor might consider reduced charges in exchange for full testimony. Chet agreed to cooperate right there without even calling his lawyer first. With Chet's cooperation secured, Carter had direct testimony about conversations that went beyond the text messages. Chet described specific phone calls where Gluttno walked him through the fake symptom strategy. He explained how Gluttno had researched PTSD criteria online and practiced his breakdown performances. He detailed conversations where Gluttno bragged about coaching other people on exploiting veteran benefit systems. Chet admitted he'd helped Gluttno edit his loan application to maximize the claimed disabilities. He provided dates and details that matched perfectly with the timeline Carter had already built. His testimony filled in gaps that the text messages alone couldn't prove. Carter recorded everything and had Chet sign a sworn statement. That same week, Ava arranged to retrieve her remaining belongings from the house. 2 police officers met her there at a scheduled time when Gluttno was required to be elsewhere per the temporary safety plan. Ava was nervous when she first walked in, but having the officers present kept her focused. She moved quickly through the rooms gathering clothes, personal documents, a few family photos, and her grandmother's jewelry that Gluttno had tried to pawn once. The officers helped carry boxes to her car. One of them did a final walkthrough to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything important. The whole process took less than an hour. Gluttno couldn't create a confrontation or show up to intimidate her because the court order required him to stay away during the retrieval time. The protective order hearing happened on a Tuesday morning. Ava sat in the courthouse waiting area with Lillian until they called her case. When she walked into the courtroom, her legs felt unsteady, but she made it to the witness stand. The judge asked her to describe the pattern of abuse. Ava spoke clearly about the staged PTSD episodes and the real violence that came with them. She explained how Gluttno would manufacture triggers to cover his anger. She described specific incidents with exact dates. She showed the judge photographs of bruises and provided the medical records. The neighbor's witness statement was entered into evidence. Gluttno's lawyer tried to suggest the injuries could have other explanations, but the documented pattern was too clear. The judge reviewed everything carefully. Then she granted a full protective order with no contact provisions for 1 year. Gluttno was prohibited from contacting Ava directly or indirectly through any means. He had to stay at least 500 feet away from her residence and workplace. Extended family members didn't stop after my group message. My aunt started calling my mom, trying to pressure her into convincing me to drop everything. 2 cousins showed up at my apartment unannounced, demanding I explain myself. I refused to engage beyond repeating that I was cooperating with a federal investigation. I wouldn't discuss details or justify my decisions. Agent Carter documented each pressure attempt as evidence of witness intimidation. When one uncle sent me a threatening text saying I'd regret destroying the family, I forwarded it to Carter and then blocked his number. I ended up blocking 5 relatives total who wouldn't respect my boundaries. It hurt to cut off family, but I wasn't going to let them manipulate me into protecting Gluttno. Agent Carter spent several days coordinating with the district attorney's office. They reviewed all the evidence together, including the recordings, the translated texts, Chet's testimony, the bank records, Danielle's statement, and Ava's documented abuse history. The prosecutor decided they had sufficient evidence to seek an arrest warrant. They drafted charges, including attempted wire fraud for the false loan application, making false statements to federal agencies about military service, and multiple counts of domestic assault under state law. The district attorney filed the warrant request with detailed supporting documentation. A judge reviewed the probable cause affidavit and signed the arrest warrant. Early on a Thursday morning, federal agents and local police arrived at Gluttno's house to execute the warrant. It was barely 6 a.m. when they knocked. Gluttno answered the door in his underwear, looking confused and angry. The lead agent identified himself and informed Gluttno he was under arrest. They read him his rights while he stood there sputtering about his Purple Heart and his service. The agents weren't interested in his performance. They handcuffed him and brought him outside in his underwear and a blanket. Neighbors stood in their yards watching the whole thing. Some of them filmed it on their phones. Additional officers went through the house with the search warrant and seized his laptop, tablet, external hard drives, filing cabinets full of financial records, and boxes of documents related to the loan application. They loaded everything into evidence vehicles. Then they put Gluttno in the back of a patrol car and drove him to the federal detention center for booking. Ava got the call from Agent Carter around 8 that morning. Carter told her Gluttno had been arrested and was in custody. Ava sat down on her apartment floor and started crying. The relief mixed with residual fear came pouring out all at once. Lillian was there within 20 minutes and sat with her while she processed the news. Lillian reminded her gently that arrest wasn't the same as conviction. There was still a long legal process ahead with hearings and possibly a trial, but this was a major step toward both safety and accountability. Gluttno couldn't hurt her from jail. The system was finally taking the abuse and fraud seriously. Ava cried for almost an hour before the shaking stopped, and she could breathe normally again. A few days later, the prosecutor called us in for a meeting at her office downtown. Ava and I sat across from her desk while she laid out thick folders of evidence and documents. She explained the charges carefully so we understood what Gluttno was actually facing. The federal charges included attempted wire fraud for the fake loan application and making false statements to government agencies about his military service. The state charges covered multiple counts of domestic assault based on the documented pattern of violence against Ava. She told us the wire fraud charge alone carried up to 20 years in prison, though actual sentences were usually much lower. The assault charges each carried 1 to 3 years under state law. She walked through realistic timelines for hearings and said we should expect the process to take several months at minimum. Gluttno's first court appearance was scheduled for the following week, and she wanted us prepared for what would happen. The judge would set bail conditions, and Gluttno would probably get released pending trial, unless he was considered a flight risk. Ava's hands shook when she heard that part. The prosecutor noticed and explained that strict conditions would protect her, including no contact orders and GPS monitoring. She said Gluttno would have to surrender his passport and stay within county limits. If he violated any conditions, he would go straight back to jail. Ava nodded, but I could see the fear hadn't left her face completely. The bail hearing happened on a Thursday morning at the federal courthouse. Ava didn't have to attend, but I went to observe from the public gallery. Gluttno stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller than I remembered. His lawyer argued he wasn't a flight risk because of his ties to the community. The prosecutor pushed back hard, citing the evidence of planned fraud and his own text messages about disappearing once the loan cleared. The judge set bail at $50,000 with conditions exactly like the prosecutor had described. No contact with Ava or me within 500 feet. GPS ankle monitor, surrender of passport, regular check-ins with pretrial services. Gluttno's parents posted the bail that same afternoon, using their house as collateral. By evening, he was out and back at his place wearing the ankle monitor. Ava got the notification through the victim services system, and I heard her voice shake over the phone when she told me. I reminded her about the protective order and the monitoring, and the fact that any violation would send him right back to jail. She said she understood, but was still going to be extra careful about her routines and routes. The loan program sent Gluttno an official denial letter within the week. Agent Howell forwarded me a copy showing they had flagged his application for fraud investigation within their internal system. The letter stated that his military service claims could not be verified, and his application showed multiple inconsistencies requiring further review. Howell told me they were implementing new procedures to catch fraud attempts earlier in the process. All applications would now require direct verification from military records databases rather than relying on documents applicants provided. They were also adding interview requirements where applicants had to answer detailed questions about their claimed service. It felt like a small victory knowing our case was pushing the system to get better at protecting itself. Howell seemed genuinely pleased that something good was coming out of the investigation beyond just prosecuting Gluttno. Lillian helped Ava move from the shelter to a short-term apartment the organization kept for women transitioning to independence. The place was small but clean, with a bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen area all to herself. Ava got the utilities set up in her own name for the first time in years. The shelter's employment program had connected her with a part-time job doing data entry for a local insurance company. The hours were flexible and the pay wasn't great, but it was hers. She could build work history and save money without Gluttno controlling every dollar. When I visited to help her set up the apartment, she showed me around with obvious pride despite how basic everything was. She had bought her own dishes and towels and groceries, small things that represented real independence after years of having nothing that was truly hers. The prosecutor called with good news about the recordings. She had researched the state's consent laws thoroughly and confirmed the audio evidence was completely admissible in court. Our state had one-party consent rules, which meant Ava could legally record conversations in her own home as long as she was present. Since Ava was a party to the conversations or present when they happened, the recordings were valid evidence. This removed a major worry I had been carrying about whether all our documentation would even be usable. Agent Carter told me the combination of audio evidence and Chet's testimony created a really strong case for prosecution. The coded texts showed intent and planning. The recordings captured Gluttno admitting to staging episodes. Chet could testify about the conspiracy from the inside. Everything lined up to prove deliberate fraud rather than just mistakes or confusion. Gluttno's preliminary hearing was scheduled for early November. Ava had to testify about the pattern of staged episodes and the violence that came with them. I met her outside the courthouse that morning, and she was visibly shaking before we even went inside. Lillian was there too, providing support and reminding her to breathe and take her time answering questions. When Ava took the stand, her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier as she described each incident. She gave specific dates and details about how Gluttno would manufacture triggers and then use the fake flashbacks to explain away hitting her or destroying property. The defense lawyer tried to suggest she was exaggerating or misremembering, but Ava held firm on the facts. She had photographs of bruises and witness statements and medical records that backed up everything she said. After almost 2 hours of testimony, the judge found probable cause to bind the case over for trial on all charges. Gluttno sat at the defense table staring at Ava the whole time with this cold expression that made my skin crawl. Danielle Green gave her sworn statement in a deposition the following week. She described Gluttno's threatening behavior at the loan office in detail, including his screaming about being a decorated combat hero and demanding special treatment. She explained how his aggression had scared other customers and staff members. Her employer submitted documentation about new safety protocols they implemented after the incident. They installed panic buttons at each desk and added security training for all loan officers about handling aggressive applicants. They also changed their verification procedures to catch fraudulent claims earlier before applicants could get angry about delays. Danielle's statement was clear and professional and would make strong evidence at trial about Gluttno's pattern of using fake military service for personal gain. Ava filed for divorce and legal separation of finances with help from the shelter's legal aid program. The paperwork clearly stated she was not responsible for any debts Gluttno had taken on during his spending spree. It documented the financial abuse alongside the physical violence and established that he had controlled all accounts and spending decisions. The filing started the process of untangling their shared bank accounts and credit cards and splitting any assets they had left after his reckless purchases. Ava told me it felt both scary and freeing to take this step. Scary because it made everything official and permanent. Freeing because she was finally claiming her own financial identity, separate from him. Chet Volkov entered a plea agreement after his lawyer explained how much trouble he was facing. He agreed to plead guilty to a reduced charge of conspiracy to commit fraud in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Gluttno. His plea hearing happened in mid-November, and he had to admit on record to helping Gluttno plan the fake PTSD scheme. He described their conversations about exploiting the veteran benefit system and confirmed the authenticity of all the text messages. He agreed to testify at trial about everything Gluttno had told him regarding the staged episodes and the loan fraud. The prosecutor told me Chet's cooperation sealed the case because now they had an insider witness who could explain the whole conspiracy from beginning to end. Ava got her first paycheck from the insurance company job 2 weeks after starting. The amount was small, but she deposited it into a new bank account she had opened in only her name. She called me that evening excited about this concrete step forward. She said seeing money in an account that Gluttno couldn't access or control felt amazing even though the legal process was still dragging on. I could hear the difference in her voice compared to a month ago. She sounded more confident and less scared even with everything still unresolved. The combination of physical safety, financial independence, and people actually believing her story was rebuilding something Gluttno had spent years tearing down. 2 weeks after Ava got that first paycheck, I walked into the VA medical center for my intake appointment. The waiting room had those standard government chairs and outdated magazines, and I filled out forms asking about deployment history and current symptoms. When the therapist called me back, she was maybe 50 with gray hair pulled into a practical bun. She asked me to describe what brought me in, and I explained how staying silent about my service had seemed easier until the investigation forced everything into the open. She nodded and said lots of veterans compartmentalize their experiences as a survival strategy. We scheduled weekly sessions, and she gave me homework about identifying triggers and coping mechanisms. Walking out, I felt weird about finally admitting I needed help, but also relieved that someone understood why I'd buried it for so long. The prosecutor called me 3 days later, asking if Ava and I could come to her office to discuss a potential plea deal. We met on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room with harsh fluorescent lights and a long table. The prosecutor explained that Glutno's lawyer was pushing for a plea agreement to avoid trial. She laid out the proposed terms, including reduced federal fraud charges, misdemeanor assault charges under state law, and mandatory treatment programs. Ava sat forward in her chair and said any deal needed real accountability, not just paperwork. The prosecutor agreed and emphasized the plea would require prison time, followed by supervised release, full restitution to the loan program, and continued no-contact orders. She asked us what justice looked like from our perspective. Ava said she needed to know he couldn't come after her again, and that other people would be protected from similar fraud. I added that the veteran community deserved accountability when someone exploited the system. The prosecutor took notes and said she'd use our input in final negotiations with the defense attorney. Ava started working on her victim impact statement the following week with Lillian's guidance. They met at the shelter office several times, going through multiple drafts. Lillian suggested focusing on concrete facts rather than dramatic language, because judges respond better to clear, specific details. Ava described the fear of living with staged episodes that could turn violent at any moment. She documented how Glutno controlled all their finances and isolated her from support systems. She wrote about the practical steps she was taking toward independence, including her new job, separate bank account, and safe housing. Lillian helped her cut out emotional generalizations and replace them with specific incidents and measurable impacts. By the final draft, Ava had a 3-page statement that read like a clear accounting of harm done and progress made. She practiced reading it aloud until her voice stayed steady, even on the hardest parts. The sentencing hearing happened on a cold morning in early December. Glutno had taken the plea deal after his lawyer explained the strength of evidence against him. We all gathered in the courtroom, including Ava, me, Lillian, and several investigators who had worked the case. Glutno sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller than I remembered. The judge reviewed the plea agreement, including guilty pleas to attempted wire fraud and 2 counts of misdemeanor assault. The prosecutor outlined the evidence and recommended 18 months federal prison, followed by 3 years supervised release. She detailed the restitution requirements and mandatory domestic violence treatment. Glutno's lawyer made a brief statement about his client accepting responsibility and requesting leniency. Then the judge asked if the victim wanted to make a statement. Ava stood up and read her impact statement in a clear, steady voice. She described the fear, the isolation, and the slow process of rebuilding safety. When she finished, the judge thanked her and said her courage was noted. The judge then sentenced Glutno to 15 months federal prison, 3 years supervised release, full restitution of investigation costs to the loan program, mandatory domestic violence treatment, and permanent no-contact orders protecting Ava. Glutno showed no reaction as marshals led him away. Ava spent the next week closing all their joint bank accounts and credit cards. The shelter's financial literacy program had taught her how to read credit reports and identify fraudulent charges. She discovered Glutno had opened several cards in her name during his spending spree and maxed them out. The program counselor helped her file disputes with the credit bureaus and document that she hadn't authorized the charges. She gathered police reports, protective order documentation, and divorce filing papers to prove the fraud context. Each account closure required phone calls, forms, and waiting periods. She opened new accounts in only her name at a different bank and set up direct deposit for her paychecks. The counselor showed her how to set up automatic payments for utilities and rent so she'd never miss deadlines. Ava told me it felt overwhelming but also empowering to finally control her own money. Her credit score would take time to rebuild, but she was making steady, documented progress. I had to accept that some family members weren't going to forgive my role in Glutno's prosecution. My aunt called me twice, leaving angry voicemails about destroying the family. 2 cousins unfriended me on social media and stopped responding to messages. My uncle sent a long email about how I should have handled things privately instead of involving authorities. I read each message once, then deleted them without responding. The family members who mattered most had stayed supportive, including my parents, who understood why I'd taken action. My mom told me she was proud I'd protected Ava, even when it meant difficult consequences. I realized that chosen family sometimes matters more than blood relatives who prioritize image over safety. I set firm boundaries with anyone who couldn't respect my decisions and stopped trying to explain or justify my choices. Some relationships were probably permanently damaged, but I felt clear about my priorities. Ava called me excited one evening about a small personal milestone. She'd spent her first completely safe night in her new apartment without jumping at every sound. The first few weeks she'd barely slept, startling awake at car doors slamming or neighbors walking past. But gradually her nervous system started accepting that she was actually safe now. Lillian had been checking in regularly with phone calls and occasional coffee meetings. I'd visited her apartment twice, bringing groceries and helping her set up furniture. She was building a support network of people who actually cared about her well-being instead of controlling her. She'd made friends with another woman at work who had also left an abusive relationship. They went to lunch together and shared practical tips about rebuilding life. Ava told me she still had hard days and therapy sessions where everything felt overwhelming, but she also had good days now where she felt hopeful about the future, instead of just scared. I sat in my apartment one evening thinking about how the past 11 weeks had unfolded since I first overheard Gluttno's phone call. The whole situation felt less like a dramatic victory and more like a quiet sense of completion. The systems had worked imperfectly, but enough for what mattered. Investigators had taken the evidence seriously instead of dismissing it. Prosecutors had held Gluttno accountable with real consequences instead of just warnings. Ava was genuinely safer now with legal protections and independent resources. We were both finally living honestly instead of keeping secrets that protected the wrong person. I thought about my own therapy sessions and how talking about my deployment was helping me process things I'd ignored for years. Ava was rebuilding her life one practical step at a time with people who supported her instead of controlled her. Gluttno was facing consequences that might actually require him to change his behavior. None of it was perfect or tied up neatly, but it mattered more than any dramatic ending could. We'd both chosen truth over comfortable silence, and that decision had led to real, measurable change.